This show has been brought to you by the Thomas Allen Collection. The Thomas Allen Collection is a men's accessory line designed to attract and capture a variety of tastes with a unique appeal. Thomas Allen strives to produce an extraordinary design to turn a new leaf on fashion for men and at desired occasions. If I told you once, I told you several times on this podcast that ladies, get your men a Thomas Allen Collection tie. They'll love it. Gentlemen, get you a Thomas Allen Collection tie. You can't go wrong with rocking a Thomas Allen Collection tie at a formal event. I'll be rocking one in an upcoming at the CBC events. BG, don't you own the Thomas Allen Collection tie?
Yes, sir. And they wave fly and anything that's already out there. I got a couple of them, so I recommend going out there and getting some of that flavor.
Yep, Thomas Allen Collection. You can reach him at 678-960-9171. 678-960-9171. Thomas Allen, when tying a knot really counts. Now on to the show.
Now, early in the morning, the day of the March on Washington, the National Mall was far from full, and some in the press were beginning to wonder if the event would be a failure. But the march's chief organizer, Bayard Rustin, didn't panic. As the story goes, he looked down at a piece of paper, looked back up, and reassured reporters that everything was right on schedule. The only thing those reporters didn't know was that the paper he was holding was blank. He didn't know how it was going to work out, but Bayard had an unshakable optimism, nerves of steel, and most importantly, a faith that if the cause is just and people are organized, nothing can stand in our way. So for decades, this great leader, often at Dr. King's side, was denied his rightful place in history because he was openly gay. No medal can change that, but today we honor Bayard Rustin's memory by taking our place in his march towards true equality, no matter who we are or who we love.
Ladies and gentlemen, a classic.
Bismillah. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gon' come. Yeah, I chose the path chose me. It's a Lord's plan, divine decree. Natural high, window sheet, up a parallel view, let the ghetto see. BK, NOLA, OMF, GLD, Amazing Grace, Hater Whispers, blah, blah, blah.
Welcome to the Free Lunch Podcast, home of the New South Movement. I am your host, Tight, and I have BG with me. BG, how are you today, sir?
Yes, indeed. I just have 2 words. Well, actually 3. No, 2. I'm ready. I'm ready. This is a big show, and I'm ready to get it on, man. How you doing today, though?
I'm doing extremely well. It's an early Saturday morning for the Free Lunch Podcast fam that'll be listening to this particular show. We are lucky to have a very, very special guest. So for those of you that actually listen to the podcast, you know that we have a number of podcasts where we bring on special guests, and we bring on guests to talk about either their story or historical figures in American history that played a really predominant role in cultivating and pushing African Americans forward, and also the civil rights movement. So with BG, with you being from Selma, I know this story in particular, and the person that we're going to talk about today is really is someone that really played a important role in American history.
And you know me very well, brother. Like you said, coming from Selma, a city that's rich in history, and more specifically rich in civil rights history. When it gets to stories like this, you know I get excited because I am a history buff, and documentaries are my choice when it comes down to genre of movies and films. So this is an exceptional opportunity for us to get familiar with a pioneer and a legendary figure in the civil rights movement that many people don't even know anything about. So it makes me think about that show that they have on TV1, Unsung.
Right.
This is definitely an unsung hero in the movement for the advancement of minorities and people that are disenfranchised in American society.
Yeah, and no further ado, we're really going to be talking about. So I was introduced a few years ago, I would say maybe even 2 years ago, to a documentary by a really close friend of mine entitled Brother Outsider, The Life of Bayard Rustin. And interestingly enough, he had saw that documentary attending an event here in, I don't know if it was in New York or D.C., but he had saw the documentary and really recommended that I go watch the documentary. And a lot of it was because he originally asked me, did I know who Bayard Rustin was? And I said, not really. And so when I started to read up on Bayard Rustin, and it became very clear that he had essentially been erased from history. Similar to a number of other individuals that I've read about that I like to ask our guests today about. But Bayard Rustin is a visionary activist and strategist who has been called the invisible man and the unknown hero of the civil rights movement. The film Brother Outsider, The Life of Bayard Rustin inspires audience to carry on Rustin's worldwide crusade against injustice, discrimination, and poverty. And just, BG, 2 years ago, President Obama actually bestowed upon Mr. Rustin the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the nation's highest civilian honor. And so when I started to read and learn about him, we were able to actually bring the producer, the editor of this documentary to one of the events that I helped to put on. And today, BG, as a special guest, we actually have Bennett Singer. He is a New York-based filmmaker and writer and editor, and he actually produced and directed Brother Outsider, which is a film that I'm going to highly recommend that the listeners go out and go view and watch. But we're going to talk a lot about the life of Bayard Rustin today. But Mr. Singer also has been credited with, his credits include the Emmy and Peabody Award-winning Eyes on the Prize with God on Our Side and The Questions of Equality. So no further ado, I would actually like to welcome and bring on Mr. Singer, who is joining us today on the podcast. So how are you doing, Mr. Singer?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for inviting me to be here.
Oh, no problem. I know we've been trying to have you on the show for a few months now.
Yes, that is putting it mildly. But I guess the good thing about Bayard's story is that it is incredibly timeless. So I'd say, talking about him now and having this in your archive is great. And in some ways, there's always new relevance and new connections between his story and what's happening in the world. So I'm glad to be here today, and I think it has ended up being good timing.
Great timing. It's funny that you said timeless, because as I was reviewing the notes and researching and watching the documentary, that's exactly what I was thinking. Is like, this story is relevant no matter what generation, no matter what time framing, because it's so many principles and fundamental elements to it, to this courageous figure who, when we get into the story, you'll see who put himself aside for the greater cause of the people. So it is definitely timeless, and I just want to tell you that it's an excellent piece. The footage, the imagery, the music, all of that stuff really tells this story in a delightful way. So thank you so much for joining us today.
No, it's great to hear that, and my colleagues and I actually spent 5 years making this film, researching it and raising the money and editing, which is a little bit of a crazy time span, but I'm happy that we got it done, and happier that now that it is done, people are actually watching it in all sorts of places. Some obvious places like film festivals and schools, but some less expected places like where we first met, Jeremy, which was a workplace kind of screening where a lot of companies and government agencies are saying, we care about diversity, and we're going to use Bayard Rustin's story to get people thinking about issues of inclusion and diversity and where this country has been and where we're going. So it's been exciting to have all sorts of different kinds of audiences. But I think you're right. His story is a universal one in the sense that it does connect to anyone who cares about leadership and teamwork and also about human rights and democracy.
Yeah.
So let's jump right into it. So one thing that BG actually noticed was that Mr. Rustin is actually a member of both of our fraternity, Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated, which was something we learned from our research and just from our history. But for our audience members, who is Bayard Rustin?
Well, you've talked about some of the key parts of his biography, but to sum it up, I would say he was a really visionary strategist and organizer at the heart of the civil rights movement. He was the main organizer of the March on Washington in 1963, which was the largest protest of the civil rights movement. Before that, he was really instrumental in bringing Gandhi's ideas of nonviolence and civil disobedience from India to America in the 40s. And then he took what he had learned and became a mentor to Martin Luther King in the 50s. They first met during the Montgomery bus boycott. And I think along with these really, huge achievements, the other thing that's pretty rare about Rustin and remarkable and partly why he's been so obscured by history is that he was very open in the 40s and 50s and 60s about being gay, and he just did not hide that and did not apologize for that and did not try to change that and did not, get married or do anything to conceal who he was. I mean, I think for him, his identity as an African American man was as important to him, or as much a essential part of who he was, as his identity as a gay man. And so the film is really about those two intersecting parts of his life, and the way that his openness about being gay both liberated him and freed him from having to hide and lead a double life, but also did cause him to pay a price, because of course American society and aspects of the civil rights movement were not ready for that. He was, and there was this homophobia and this discrimination that affected him. But ultimately, I think he did find a way to maintain his involvement in the civil rights movement. As you were saying earlier, he kind of decided or chose to be in the background mostly and to serve as a behind-the-scenes advisor and strategist more than a out-front leader, in part because he understood that there was this risk or this potential liability related to his identity. And so I think, the world is catching up with Rustin now, and it's really interesting to see the ways in which the two communities that he was a part of, i.e. the African American community and the LGBT community, have in recent years really found some strong connections and resonances and new ways to work together and to coexist. And of course, there are many people who are part of both communities. But I think in the past, there's been this sense of being forced to choose for African American LGBT folks, and there's been some amazing discussions that Rustin's story has opened up. For instance, like the NAACP a couple years ago did a panel using the film, specifically looking at homophobia in the Black community, and a number of LGBT organizations have been using the film to try to think about how they can become more conscious of racial justice. So it's been used in a lot of constructive ways to bring people together, using this sort of heroic and very unknown but inspiring life to get people talking.
and regardless of how you feel about sexual preference, orientation, the work is undeniable. And when we get into this story, you'll see that the sacrifices and the focus that this man had in the face of all of that type of adversity and other adversities that we'll get into is just amazing. And it really is a model of what leadership and leading people is all about. So you can't deny the work.
I think that's true. Yes, and I think it has reached audiences and got them thinking about about all of those questions, because at the heart of his story is this sense of integrity and authenticity. As I said before, his real insistence about just being his self, being his authentic self, and that I think is a timeless piece of what his story can sort of teach us.
Do you think that his behind the scenes organizing and kind of as an advisor role played to him being kind of erased and invisible from the history books, or do you think a lot of that is because of his sexual preferences? And then number two to that question, because I was not familiar with Mr. Rustin until I watched the documentary. So what drew you to make a documentary on a story such as this?
After college, I was incredibly lucky to end up first as an intern and then as a researcher on the PBS project Eyes on the Prize, which is a 14-hour documentary series on the history of the civil rights movement. And I would say if folks haven't seen that, I would urge them to check it out. It's part of it, at least, is on Netflix and hopefully is available in libraries or online. So I was working on that and fact checking or doing some research on the March on Washington, and quickly discovered Rustin. And I felt in some ways like I had opened up a novel and was meeting this character who some author had invented, because the more I read about him, the more I felt like could this really be one person in one life? His work was just so expansive and covered so many different social movements and so many different parts of the world. I'm sure we'll talk more about it, but he interacted with and had a whole series of debates with Malcolm X, for instance. He was involved in African independence movements and anti-apartheid movements and international human rights, and of course the work with Martin Luther King was central. And so there were just so many pieces to this. And for me, as a gay man, I really was inspired by his openness, because he came out to his grandmother, as we say in the film, when he was in high school.
Right,
that would have been like 1928. And I'll just say, when I was in high school, I was terrified, and was not brave enough to come out to my grandmother or anyone, And I think people still have that dilemma today. Things are certainly changing in huge ways about American society and people coming out and being open. But so his story really did resonate with me. But I think that point that, for so many people, black and white, he is or has largely been unknown and just very obscure, very hidden from history. One writer has even said it's not that he's been forgotten by history, it's that he's been expunged from history, with suggesting that historians have made a conscious effort, at least until recently, to leave him out and to write him out of the books. And I think that's definitely true when you're talking about textbooks and school, presentations of the civil rights movement, from which he has been largely omitted and absent until recently. And I think there, a lot of it reflects that discomfort that American society has had and still to some extent does have about talking about sexual orientation, and he just was not ashamed and was not willing to hide, and that posed an issue for folks in who were writing the history and for folks he worked with in the movement. But I just think fighting for his equality as an African American man while ignoring his identity as a gay man just would not have been true to him. That would have been sort of a betrayal. And so that's kind of at the core of why he's important, but also why he was, in some circles, left in the background or relegated to the background.
From watching the documentary, he was from Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And he played football, and he was a football player. He was a orator, a singer. Can you speak to his, and you even mentioned how in high school he spoke to his grandmother, Ma, and basically informed her, at the dance that I guess he specifically said something along the lines that he preferred to be around the men at the party.
Right.
But can you kind of speak on his high school days?
He grew up in Westchester, Pennsylvania, not far from Philadelphia. He was born in 1912, and as I understand it, he went to segregated elementary schools, but an integrated high school. And he was quite a star athlete and a tennis player and a football player. We actually found some actual footage of him playing football.
Yeah, how did you find that footage?
I know. That was one of the miraculous discoveries in terms of the archival, going to historical archives and trying to track down pieces of his life.
Right.
That footage, we called his high school in Westchester, and we're hoping to maybe find an old yearbook or a newspaper or some photo or something. And miraculously enough, they actually had film footage of him and his teammates playing football in what would have been like 1928.
Right.
So that was a huge, exciting day for us.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it does bring it to life. And I think it's, in terms of stereotypes and, thinking about the image of what you might expect, that piece of his life certainly is a strong one and a kind of a surprising one to some people, I think, in the sense that there he was, really out there, in the sort of masculine, macho, athletic way as really a star athlete. But at the same time, he was really a talented singer, and he ended up being a music major as a college student, and really always used singing as part of his activism.
You don't have to ride Jim Crow, no, you don't have to ride Jim Crow. On June the 3rd, the High Court said, when you ride in the state, Jim Crow is dead. You don't have to ride Jim Crow. And when you get on the bus, get on the bus, said any place, 'cause Irene Morgan won her case. You don't have to ride Jim Crow. You don't have to ride Jim Crow. No, you don't have to ride Jim Crow. Go quiet like if you face arrest. NAACP will make a test. You don't have to ride Jim Crow. And someday we'll all be free. Yes, someday we'll all be free. When united action turns the tide and black and white sit side by side. Oh, someday we'll all be free.
He recorded 2 different albums of spirituals and other songs, which we used a lot of in the movie, where he's and we use the music not just as sort of background music, but there's a way in which him singing certain songs connects to his own story, and so the lyrics of certain songs like "Scandalize My Name" is one, or "Motherless Child," or there are songs that he sings that are actually very connected to his own his own story. And so the music is fantastic, I think. And he actually moved to New York after college and was on Broadway briefly. That's one thing that's not in the film, but he ended up in the late 30s on Broadway with Paul Robeson in a show that didn't last very long, but I think he could have ended up being, a singer or a performer full time, but this part of him that was really committed to racial justice and to civil rights became his main focus, and so he did pursue that form of activism, after he moved to New York, and we could talk more about the different protest movements and the different allies he had, but he, from an early age, I think, was challenging segregation and was out there protesting really tirelessly.
You bring up a good point, and I actually wrote this down in my notes. I wanted to ask you about this. Recently, over the past year, I started reading and studying about Paul Robeson, and I kind of saw how he was also kind of erased from the history books. So with the relationships and the time frame of Mr. Rustin, I wanted to ask you if there was a relationship between Paul and between Mr. Rustin and Paul Robeson, because they both kind of, again, there were some similarities in that they both kind of got erased from the history books. I noticed how the FBI constantly followed Mr. Rustin just as they did with with Paul, but then also just the time frame. Did they have a relationship at all? Did they have conflicting viewpoints on how the civil rights movement and things of that nature should be handled? What was their relationship?
It's a good question. I mean, and I don't really know in depth the full answer to that. As I said, I know that they certainly met each other and were acquainted with each other, partly because they were co-stars of this Broadway production. I think, there was this big difference in their political philosophies, because Rustin, for a short time, was a member of what was then called the Young Communist League, but before World War II, he ended up withdrawing from that and kind of renouncing his interest in communism and feeling very disillusioned by the communist movement. Whereas, as I understand it, Paul Robeson was a much stronger believer and long-term believer in the philosophy of communism and its ideals, and so there was that difference. And as you said, they both were under the radar of the FBI, absolutely. And we ended up getting Rustin's FBI file, which was like 10,000 pages, and excerpts from that we used in the film. But I think Rustin and Robeson certainly, stayed in touch and their paths crossed during the years after they worked together in that Broadway show. But beyond that, I'm not entirely sure how much interaction there was.
Talking about that and him being involved with different activist groups, he really, I think somewhere it stated that he had over 60 years of fighting for human rights and things like that. And one of the terms that he used was that we needed a generation of angelic troublemakers. And I think that speaks to, we talked about him being an excellent performer, a singer, an orator and an athlete, but you kind of hit on it. He also had a life of fighting injustice that was being found throughout society. He had a story about him when he was a young kid, going to a local restaurant that was segregated, that didn't serve blacks, and he went in and he was ready to go to jail even at a young age.
As I understand it, as a high school student, he did go to jail for protesting the segregation at the local movie theater and restaurant in his hometown, which is kind of wild, as a 16-year-old to be that self-confident and that courageous, because even in places that are somewhat north of the Deep South, there's still the potential for violence and for who knows what that could happen in jail. So the fact that he was willing to do that, I think, at the age of like 16, does underscore his just this inherent sense of fighting for justice.
And he got kicked out of Wilberforce for protesting that the food was disgusting. So
Right.
he was just that type of guy that if he saw something unequal or something that blocked a certain segment of people away from certain accesses, he was willing to step out, regardless of the consequences that might be staring him in the face. But let's talk about that, though. In being in that position and being so involved in social movement, he encountered a lot of different people that actually were experts and leaders in their said positions. One being A.J. Musty and another being A. Philip Randolph and some others down the road. Can you talk a little bit about the period of time with A.J. Musty and the Fellowship of Reconciliation?
Sure. A.J. Musty was the head of a group called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was a Christian pacifist group that was really committed to trying to get America to embrace the idea of pacifism and to stay out of World War II. And Rustin was one of the believers or members of that group who refused to register for the draft during World War II. As I said, he was a Quaker, and Quakers believe that war is wrong and that killing is wrong. And so, as a conscientious objector, he was so opposed to the idea of military service that he refused to even register, as I understand it. And it was for that reason that he ended up being sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for refusing to be part of the selective service system. When he got out of prison, he continued working with Musty and really traveling around the country and trying to go to college campuses and other kinds of community groups and help people learn about pacifism and nonviolence. Some of his political views changed over his life, but I do think that belief in nonviolence as the most effective way to bring about social change never did change. That for Rustin was really at the center of what he believed was the key to bringing about progress and moving America towards equality. And I think it, as the civil rights movement played out in cities like Birmingham and Selma, and you saw the power of the March on Washington and other nonviolent protests, and including the Montgomery bus boycott, where he first met Dr. King, there certainly was a huge effectiveness and power to nonviolent protest. So that was central to his philosophy and his work with Musty and that group continued through the early 50s, but they parted ways because in 1953, Rustin was actually arrested on a, quote, morals charge for engaging in a sexual act in a public place or in a parked car, actually. Which I think, sort of again speaks to this double standard. You got to figure if it had been a heterosexual encounter, I have a feeling the policeman would have knocked on the window and said, move it along or get a room. But
right.
With Rustin, he got arrested. He got sentenced to 30 days in jail. This became front page news in the LA Times because he was out in LA then. And so that it really was a kind of a major setback for him. And at that point, he was allowed to or forced to resign from his work with the Fellowship of Reconciliation and really and Musty and especially since this was a Christian pacifist group, felt like that taint or that problem, especially given how public it had become, would not allow Rustin to keep working with him, and so that really was a turning point.
And that past would follow him 10 years later, because after he split with that organization, then he started working with A. Philip Randolph. Is that correct?
He was, Randolph was absolutely one of his other two key mentors, along with Musty. And Randolph was the leading trade unionist, African American trade unionist in America, and had founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and was really like a father figure, I think, to Rustin, starting in the 40s. And I think Randolph recognized Rustin's brilliance and really nurtured him. And the other piece of Rustin's vision was seeing this civil rights and political rights as very interconnected with economic justice. And he, with Randolph, felt like the trade union movement was one very effective way for African American people, or any anybody who was looking for economic improvement across racial lines to advance.
All over the country, people are telling me, you can't depend on the unions. They're anti-Negro. They won't stand with you. Well, I think the record here shows that in Memphis, this fight is going to be won because the black people of this community and the trade unions stand together, man to man.
And so Rustin had this lifelong connection with and belief in the power of unions to uplift, people who were struggling. He and Randolph had proposed a march on Washington actually back in the early 1940s, and that got canceled or not even postponed. It got canceled because this threat to march on Washington was enough of a threat to persuade FDR, the president at the time, to integrate the defense industries. And so Randolph and Rustin had been threatening to bring thousands of people to Washington, and that persuaded the president to issue an executive order which integrated the defense industries, which had been the main demand of this march. So they canceled the march. Rustin, I think, was disappointed because he really felt that this march, or the idea of a march, would be, this very empowering process for people. And I think there was a rift at that point between him and Randolph, but it was obviously, I think, understandable that Randolph chose to cancel that march because FDR had responded, somewhat miraculously, or at least, positively, by saying, if I'm going to give you what you want. And so Randolph, I think, did, the mature thing by agreeing to call off that march. But Rustin, I think, was always really determined or convinced that a march on Washington would be a huge event for America and for everybody who participated. And eventually he and Randolph worked together to implement what became the biggest protest in American history up to that point, which was the 1963 March on Washington.
And that's why I think BG, in the opening, when he kind of gave Rustin the pioneer, father or the father of the civil rights movement, in a lot of ways, I think it was appropriate because of what you just mentioned earlier, with how he had started. These are things that I learned in the documentary as well. How he had started trying to do a march on Washington back in the early 40s. Keep me honest, Mr. Singer, but I know there's a lot we may have missed, but two things I really wanted to make certain we touch on was his time in North Carolina and the articles he wrote after that experience in jail. But then I also wanted to speak on when he eventually met up with Dr. King.
Yes.
So I believe it was the North Carolina incident that occurred first.
Yeah, that was 1947. Rustin was part of the first Freedom Ride, which was called the Journey of Reconciliation, and it was a group, I think it was 12, an integrated group of 12 riders who were testing a Supreme Court law which said that segregation had been banned on interstate buses, but some local law enforcement authorities, particularly in North Carolina, refused to obey the Supreme Court. And so Rustin ended up getting arrested in North Carolina and sentenced to 30 days on a chain gang. And he did serve that time, but also wrote about the experience for a series of newspapers. And as a result of that publicity, the state ended up deciding to abolish the chain gang. So it's another example where his activism really had a huge impact. And I think, that's another also example of the way in which aspects of his life have resonance for us today, because I think one of the present day headlines is if you look at what's going on in Kentucky, where this county clerk is refusing to enforce the same-sex marriage decision. It's very analogous or parallel to what Rustin was protesting back in 1947 in North Carolina.
Right. I did want to fast forward to his meeting with Dr. King, and you actually have an excerpt from the movie. Forget the name. Was that the Dr. King movie or
Boycott, which was an HBO film, a dramatic film with Jeffrey Wright as Dr. King, and Eric Dellums as Rustin, looking at the Montgomery bus boycott. And HBO very generously let us use a little clip from that movie in our documentary. Primarily, for us, it was great because there was no film footage that we could find of them together in Montgomery. There's like one photograph and some newspaper headlines, but that scene from the HBO movie really dramatizes their first meeting, and it was 1956 when King and Rustin met, and the dramatic and surprising, I think, conversation that they have relates to the question about nonviolence and how to lead the Montgomery bus boycott in the face of these threats of violence, which were, very real, and there were bombings and other real attacks on Dr. King's house and threats of other attacks. And so at the time they met, Dr. King actually had armed guards outside of his house and apparently had guns inside his house. And Rustin, who had, as we said before, had been in India and had really been thinking about and working with the idea of Gandhian nonviolence for more than, for a lot of 20 years at that point, became a mentor to Dr. King and really persuaded him that he should not have these guns in his house, and that he should become more fully nonviolent.
Our power is in our ability to make things unworkable. The only weapon we have is our bodies, and we need to tuck them in places so wheels don't turn.
And of course, Dr. King went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and I think ultimately agreed with Rustin that there's this moral high ground that you have if you don't surround yourself with weapons of violence. And that on a moral level, that's the more powerful position. Of course, it's on a practical level, it can be quite a risky or perilous situation to feel like you're surrounded by people with guns and you're not armed. But that's kind of the essence of what Gandhi stood for and what King came to stand for.
I think it's important that we set the scene here because at this point, Dr. King is 25 years of age, and Rustin, how old is he at this time?
In 56, he would have been 44.
So he's 44 at this time, at this stage, and he had essentially had different advisors and individuals that he had worked with and that had kind of mentored him. He had already, at this point, he had already made his first trip to India to meet Gandhi, or
that was like 10 years earlier, and he had spent months in India and really seen India achieve independence, which happened in the 40s, 1947. And so he had lived through that process and really understood the practical workings of nonviolence. I think Dr. King had read about that and had thought about it, but hadn't had the same kind of actual day-to-day experience with the idea, with the workings of nonviolence. And of course, the Montgomery bus boycott had been initially intended as a one-day protest, and it stretched out to last for a year. And so I think, the question of how the leaders of that protest would actually sustain the protest and make it effective was a huge one. And Rustin, I think, played a big role in helping the folks in Montgomery, including Dr. King, succeed in their protest.
Yeah, that's why I thought it was important that we kind of mentioned that at this stage in the game, Rustin is pretty seasoned with the relationships he had built, and having that trip over to meet Gandhi and those sort of things kind of helped shape who he was. But then he could also pour into a young 25-year-old Dr. King during this pivotal moment in American history.
In this period of time is kind of where I first came to know about the name Rustin. I read a book, Bearing the Cross. Well, actually, I kind of cheated. I had the audio book, so I would I would listen to it on my commute to work. And it talked about this relationship that Dr. King and Bayard had in terms of exchanging this information and Bayard kind of being an advisor to what was going on. And it's real interesting when you think about it, because most of us, when we talk about this civil rights history and Dr. King, we know that he was a student of Gandhiism, and we know that his movement was based in nonviolence. But it's like, well, where did he get it from? Did it just come to him one day in a vision, or was there some influence that introduced him to these practices and to really see it? And like, there was a real person standing beside him that he was actually leaning to for this information that helped him strategize these acts and these protests and all of these things, and how they were done with a reason and an objective behind them. It's real. I mean, to see that Mr. Rustin's imprint on what we know as the civil rights movement, and to know that it was coming from the brain of one man sharing all of these experiences and this wisdom that he had encompassed over his life is just amazing to me.
And Mr. Singer, just to give you some background on both BG and I, we're both from the state of Alabama. So this period in history really resonates with both he and I, because we grew up in the state of Alabama. Alabama history is something that we learned growing up through grade school. So this is why this story really resonates with us, and the relationship that Mr. Rustin had with Martin Luther King is really interesting. One quick question I had for you was, and with BG being from Selma, I'm from Mobile, but with with BG being from Selma, and then with the 50th March on Selma being celebrated this year, did Mr. Rustin actually make it to Selma at all? I did see in the documentary he had a sign that basically said, "We march with Selma," and I don't know if that was at a different location, but did you, during your research, did you see any trips made to Selma, Alabama?
He definitely was down there. at times. Think that there was a New York march on the same day as the Montgomery March, and my sense is that Rustin was up north for that particular stage of things. But during the Selma campaign, he was certainly down there multiple times, and was involved in the strategy and the meeting with LBJ, along with Dr. King, and so he was involved in the Selma movement, certainly.
That was the statement that was made, and I guess he got this from his trip to India, was to turn like regular conflicts into creative conflicts. And when you look in Birmingham, the protests, Birmingham, turning that conflict with Bull Connor into a creative conflict to get the attention of the world. You got the Montgomery boycott, get the attention of the Montgomery economic establishment by showing that, you know, we have some economic power. We don't ride the buses, the bus system closes. And all of these things were in that mode of who's the adversary that's getting in the way from where we're trying to get to, and how do we turn this conflict into something positive to push our cause forward. And so you got to know that he had some influence on the things that happened in Selma.
There was a point where Dr. King and Mr. Rustin kind of had a disagreement, or they kind of stopped communicating for a little while. So I did want to touch on that and then kind of transition into the actual organizing of the March on Washington.
There was a rift between King and Rustin. In 1960, they were planning some demonstrations at the Democratic Convention, and Adam Clayton Powell, who was an African-American congressman from Harlem, didn't want those protests to happen, and I think Powell was reflecting the wishes of LBJ and the Democratic Party leadership, who felt like protests would, you know, on civil rights issues would distract from their agenda. And so Powell went to King and said if they didn't call off those threatened protests, that Powell would then go to the press and spread the rumor, which was totally false, but quite a threat to King, I think. The rumor would be that King and Rustin were engaged in a sexual affair, and that was, as you can imagine, quite a effective threat, which led King to call off the protests and also to distance himself or encourage Rustin to resign. So for several years, they were officially they're estranged, I guess the word would be. You know, they didn't work together the way that they had before. They came back together and reconnected in 1963 before the March on Washington. But there was, again, that period where this sort of discrimination and homophobia was allowed to create this wedge between Rustin and King.
And I found it interesting as we transition to the actual March on Washington and the organization of that. Two things that stuck out to me was, number one, the actual march was changed to August because it was originally looked out, if I recall, that it was going to be in January of 1963. And then the second thing I kind of wanted to point out was when he was actually organizing it, and one of the reporters kind of asked him where all these buses at, he pulled out basically a blank sheet of paper and his phone or a notepad, his watch. He pulled out a blank sheet of paper and his watch, and he essentially said, everything's right on schedule, but he wasn't really sure, or he wasn't sure where the buses were that were coming to participate in the march.
That's an example of Rustin's humor, I think. He wasn't sure who would show up on August 28th, 1963 for the march, and there is that story that he tells in the film about reporters asking him, "Where is everybody?" And he supposedly pulls out a piece of paper and reads from it and says everything is going according to schedule, except it turns out that the paper was blank. So, and then of course more people showed up than he ever anticipated. It turned out to be an estimated 250,000 people for that march, which made it the biggest protest up to that point in American history. And of course, that was the day where Martin Luther King gave the "I Have a Dream" speech, and there were other, amazing and powerful speeches, including one by John Lewis from SNCC. And I think the overall impact was that partly because it was so nonviolent and so peaceful and so orchestrated by Rustin and so coordinated, there was the sense that, there's this movement and this collective will to have America live up to its ideals and its promises. And, one of the basic realities at that point in 1963 was that voting rights were a huge issue in much of the country, and literacy tests were still allowed, and percentage of African Americans who were registered to vote in places like Alabama and Mississippi was, like 5% as of 1960. So there were, and other basic civil rights also were not yet in place. And so the March on Washington really sent a very clear message. I'll just say that the official organizing manual for the march is on our website, which is rustin.org, and people may be interested in downloading that and reading it. I think it's on the screenings page, along with some other writings by Rustin. But it's fascinating to look at the both the sort of philosophical reasons that people came together for the march, but also the logistical details that Rustin spells out in this document about, it's down to the level of, August 28th is likely to be a hot summer day. So when you're packing your lunch, don't bring a bologna sandwich, bring peanut butter and an apple. And of course it's, if people had gotten sick and, the headline was, thousands end up with food poisoning at the March on Washington, that would have been a very different message than the one that ultimately came through. And similarly, in that document, he talks about that the only signs that people would be allowed to carry would be pre-printed ones that the March Committee had approved. And if you look at the footage, again, that piece of Rustin's organizational approach is very clear. The footage is just so orderly and dignified and coordinated, and there is this, in terms of messaging, there's just like this unmistakable message, which is just basically we want full equality now. So there is a very Rustin's fingerprints and Rustin's influence, I think, can be seen in so many different ways on that day.
Funny thing, there's a portion in there where A. Philip Randolph takes the podium to announce the outcome in relationship to the number of people that were in attendance. And if you look over to the right, you see Bayard, and he is actually mouthing the exact words that A.
Yes.
Philip Randolph is saying. So you really see how involved he was. He knew word for word what he was going to say at that moment in time.
I agree. I love that. That footage is really interesting. And it's like, how could he know? He wasn't reading it, but I guess he had written it. And he is mouthing the words there. He's also mouthing the words right in the next scene where Jackson is singing. And Rustin was, of course, also a singer, but I don't know, that piece of the film and that footage it's like it reminds you what you could do, what you can show in a film versus in a book, I think.
Exactly.
And to be able to see that in like 20 seconds and just see the joy on Rustin's face and the sense of, having worked for months and months to try to bring this protest to reality, I think that must have been the happiest day of his life. Yeah. And I do love that footage. It's really, it just tells us so much about Rustin's sort of spirit.
I did want to kind of fast forward and go ahead and wrap us up a little bit, not really telling too much of the the end of the documentary, because I think you mentioned earlier, and we saw this in the documentary, how his views kind of changed. But one other polarizing figure during that time period, civil rights, was Malcolm X. And there's footage and there's a debate that happened between Rustin and Malcolm X. Can you kind of speak on that particular debate or the relationship between Malcolm X and Mr. Rustin during this period?
As I understand it, there were some students at Howard University who wanted Malcolm X to come and talk to them on campus, and the administrators were hesitant to make that happen. And Rustin apparently stepped in and said, Malcolm X is an important leader and thinker, and the students should have a chance to hear him. So why don't we have a debate where, we will talk about integration versus separation. And Rustin, offered to go to Howard and talk with Malcolm X about the philosophy of social change as he saw it versus Malcolm X's philosophy. And that ended up being a debate that they took to several cities, including New York, where there was footage which we incorporated in the film. So it was a fascinating conversation.
The problem can never be stated in terms of black and white, and any movement which begins by blotting out the active cooperation of the best minds, many of which are white as well as black, is fighting a losing battle.
South Africa doesn't preach freedom. Russia doesn't call itself the leader of the free world. It's America that looks upon herself and represents herself as the leader of the free world, while she has 20 million black people here who aren't even citizens. It is for this reason that America is doomed, and it is for this reason that we who follow the Honorable Elijah Muhammad feel that our only hope is not integration with a doomed society, but complete separation from a doomed society.
And hearing it, I think, there are pieces of what each of them say that strike me as incredibly true and relevant. Malcolm X is very strong and clear about saying, America claims to be the world's greatest democracy, and yet, millions of people can't vote here because of our skin color. What is that about? Right. And Rustin keeps going back to nonviolence and pacifism and the idea that the goal should be integration and having America live up to its promises of equality. And so it is a fascinating conversation. And I think the fact that they agreed to have that series of debates is such a kind of inspiring event, especially when you think about how polarized things are today and how the people from competing philosophical positions often just demonize each other and don't talk to each other the way Rustin and Malcolm X did. But I think Rustin absolutely respected and wanted folks in the greater community to understand what Malcolm X stood for and to be able to think through the ramifications of that question about integration versus separation.
You've done a lot of work with film, with print, and it seems like with your life covering issues such as this, being kind of on the forefront of highlighting these moments and these social movements and highlighting social injustices in this country. What is it that has put you in a position or has put it on your heart to use your skill and your craft to shed light on these elements?
For me, so much of the film work that I've done has grown out of that first project that I had the good fortune to work on, which was Eyes on the Prize. And the kind of tagline of that series was, this is a documentary series about the civil rights movement and about the movement to make America be America, and that is such a classic and a sort of powerful notion about this country and its goals and its stated, the gap between what it says it believes in and what it actually embodies. And I think that has kind of guided a lot of the subsequent projects that I've worked on. We didn't talk about it, but I more recently than the Rustin film, did a film about voting rights, which is called Electoral Dysfunction, which is on a lot of the online platforms, digital platforms these days, iTunes and Amazon and Google. It's a film about voting rights that looks at, sort of problems with our voting system. It's hosted by Mo Rocca from CBS Sunday Morning, and it's his road trip to look at both how our voting system works and how it could be reformed to be made fairer. So that's another example tied into the Rustin film of a project that is really trying to look at the separation or the gap, as I said, between America's promises and ideals and philosophical hopefulness and some of the realities that need to be addressed to bring us closer to that potential. The other thing I wanted to say on the Rustin film is streaming for free these days at pbs.org until 2016. So if folks want to check it out, you can just go to pbs.org and type in Rustin, and you'll have access to the full 84-minute version of the documentary, or you can get the DVD from our website, which is rustin.org, or from Amazon. But it's, I would be really happy if people who hear this have a chance to check out the film and share it with folks in their communities. And I thank you both for taking the time to do all the research you did and to focus on Rustin and to include him in your series of podcasts, because I do think he, as we said at the beginning, is an unsung hero who deserves to be remembered.
Is there any chance we could see this on the big screen?
Well, it's been at various theaters, mostly in film festivals and kind of special screenings around the country. So as those events are scheduled, we generally list them on the screenings page of rustin.org. I know, for instance, like here in New York, the Brooklyn Historical Society has a screening coming up in November. I think it's November 2nd, and various theaters and community groups around the country have and will be planning screenings. So that's the closest we're likely to get to a theatrical release at this point. But we, if people are interested in hosting screenings on campuses or community groups, they should certainly get in touch, and there's a contact link at our website, and we have been excited to have a chance. I took it to Selma actually a couple years ago in South Africa with Walter Nagel, who was Rustin's life partner, who's done a lot of work with us, and all sorts of places here and abroad have been showing it. So there's that potential to have a special screening and to have some folks who worked on the film be there to do a Q&A.
It's the real deal. Numerous awards, featured Sundance Film Festival selection, GLAAD Media Award for Outstanding Documentary. So it's the real deal. And the Electoral Dysfunction is good too, Type. It's a good documentary too, talking about voting and voting disenfranchisement. So I speak volumes on both of these projects.
And Mr. Singer, I'm definitely going to check out the Electoral Dysfunction. Mr. Singer, last question. What are you working on now?
Well, in the short term, we actually got a grant to create a version of the Electoral Dysfunction movie for schools. And we are finishing that up this fall and planning to distribute it for free, actually, to middle schools and high schools to be used in social studies and history classes. If teachers are interested in requesting that, they can go to the electoraldysfunction.org website, and there's a classroom link there. But we are planning to make that available as a free resource for teachers with a big curriculum guide this fall, so that'll be good timing before the 2016 election.
Oh, that's right on time. BG, I think we need to try to figure out how to get some of these in the South, sir.
We'll definitely be using this platform to exchange this information and to keep our listeners aware of these movements.
Mr. Singer, really appreciate your time and taking the time out on this Saturday to speak with BG and I on an incredible human being, Bayard Rustin, and the role that he played in the civil rights movement and just in American history. So, again, it was many attempts, and we finally were able to actually have the interview. I hope it went as smooth, and I hope it was as good to you as it was for us.
Absolutely. I appreciate your persistence. It did take some wrangling to find a time that work for all of us, but I'm really glad it came together, and I'm excited that folks who are regular listeners of your podcast will either discover Rustin for the first time or learn some more about him. I hope through this conversation. And again, thanks to both of you for taking the time to include him and the film in your series.
Oh, thank you. And BG, how can the people reach us?
Well, first of all, I just want to close out and say I hope that we did him justice with this piece and what we've talked about today. But first, we'll give Mr. Singer an opportunity to remind the people of some of the contact information, ways that they can get more information on your projects, this project, and any other thing that you want them to be aware of.
Oh, okay, thanks. So rustin.org, RUSTIN.org is the website for this film. If you want to watch the film, I think the easiest free way to do that is pbs.org. It is on Netflix in DVD format as well. And then the new film that I mentioned is electoraldysfunction.org. And there are contact links on both of those sites, so if people want to track us down with questions or to talk about potential screenings in their communities, they should feel free to get in touch.
And we'll post those links as well. And so for the Free Lunch Podcast, check us out, freelunchpodcast.com for podcasts and blogs. Also, if you want to leave us some comments on this podcast or any of our previous ones, you can use Twitter, Free Lunch Pod C. Also, check for us on Instagram, Free Lunch Podcast. And be sure to check out some of our videos on Free Lunch TV, YouTube.
And also, you can reach us for those that are into sports and entertainment. We do have the D1 Sports Talk podcast that's released on every Tuesday. That's D, the number 1, Sports Talk podcast. You can find that, and we're also on Gmail at D1sportstalk D1sportstalkpodcast@gmail.com, as well as D1sportstalkpodcast.blogspot.com. So thank you all for joining us on this particular podcast. We truly enjoyed Mr. Singer. And until the next time, this is the Free Lunch Podcast. We are home to the New South movement, and we are out of here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bring to you the executive director of the March on Washington, the man who organized this whole thing, Mr. Bayard Rustin.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first demand is that we have effective civil rights legislation, no compromise, no filibuster, and that it includes public accommodation, decent housing, integrated education, FAPC, and the right to vote. What do you say?
Let's go, let's get it. Let's go, let it go now. Let it go, let's get it. Get it, got 'em. Let's go, let's get it. Let's go, let it go now. Let it go, let's get it. Super mathematics, not a problem, no knock for that old block. So sign away for that gold rock. Super small, handcrafted art designs, no they know not. Flow tougher than tough time, blacker than the gram, they drum line. No overdose, I'm overwoke, I'll be awake before crunch time. Yeah, well like sunshine, I leave right close. Punchline, I beat the track, I eat the track, brown paper breakfast, lunchtime, dinner date, dessert tray, Ramadan, flow hungry, you see the sign between the line and G's only, no dummies, I flow lovely, they go nutty, they catch a feeling, these hoes touchy, I tell that jump off, no bunches, no awakening, home study, but you're so pretty, bless your soul, sometimes the best way to touch him, stand and go, let's go, let's go, let's get it, let's go, let it go now. Let's go, let's go, let's get it. Let's go, let it go now. Let it go, let's get it. Mathematics, before I chose the path chose me. This is a Lord's plan, divine decree.